Want me to begin?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Mr.
Sorry.
Jain,
Yeah.
should we
Yeah.
begin now?
Yeah. Begin, but just let me say Prakash to. Yes.
Please
Recording
mute,
has started. Now you can begin, please. Mute everyone, please.
let him mute everyone except Javier and me. Let him mute everyone except Javier and me.
Already muted, sir.
Okay, thank you. So good morning, everyone. Once again, it's nice to see such a large number of people attending the Indore study cycle talk. Today our speaker is Mr. Javier Gomez Rodriguez, and Javier is going to speak to us on case teachings, a reading of the book of mankind. So I'll briefly say something about Javier and then we can begin the talk. Javier, at the customary here is, I'll briefly introduce you, and after your talk is over, Dr. Gajanan Rao and Mr. Harsh Tankha can give their observations for maybe 10 to 15 minutes. And then the floor is open for participants to ask questions. So a brief introduction about Javier. Javier comes originally from Spain. In his mid-teens, he came across the work of Krishnamurti and was instantly struck by its wholeness and ring of truth. From 1975 to 78, Javier was a student at Brockwood Park School. The school K had founded in England in 1969. After completing a BA in the Humanities and an MA in the Spanish language and literature in the United States, he returned to Brockwood Park as a teacher in 1990. There he met up with K's close collaborator, Professor David Bohm, and actively engaged with him in the exploration of the latter's dialogue proposal. Javier spent 2 years, from 1993 to 95, as a resident scholar at the KFI headquarters in Vasant Vihar, Chennai. On his return to Spain, he conducted a K-inspired inquiry group, translated several Krishnamurti books into Spanish, and became a trustee of the Spanish Foundation, the K Foundation responsible for disseminating his work in the Spanish-speaking world. He also joined Krishnamurti Link International, an informal group of former Brockwood staff members brought together by the German industrialist Friedrich, who was K's close friend during the last 2-3 years of his life and a lifelong financial supporter of the K institutions worldwide. Javier was one of the main editors of KLI's magazine, The Link. Many of us are aware of that magazine, which served as an international forum for the study of the teachings. In 2000, Javier moved to the Netherlands, where he has been residing ever since. He has been collaborating with the Dutch Krishnamurti Committee and continues to be associated with KLI. He edits Friedrich's newsletter and is active in KLI's international network of activities. In 2016, Javier started giving a course offering a comprehensive introduction to K's life and teachings. The idea for this course stems from his sense that they are universal in nature and a potential avenue of significant insight and fundamental change. As such, he feels they deserve the closest study as well as widest dissemination, for they are a veritable education for mankind. Javier is currently working on compiling a book on K's life and teachings based on his research for the course. With the outbreak of the pandemic, he is hoping to be able to offer his introduction to K's life and teachings online in the near future. I can go on and on because Javier has been deeply involved in K's work, but I think I'll stop here. And with these words, I'll request Javier to please go ahead and start your talk. And once again, thanks a lot for accepting our offer to be a part of this group. Thank you so much. Yes, Javier, please.
Okay, well, thank you for the invitation, really. This is very special. I haven't been to India and I miss it a bit. So this is a bit of, reminds me of that very special time I was there and for which I will always be very grateful to KFI. What I'm actually going to share with you, or I intend to share with you, is this very notion of Krishnamurti's teachings as a reading of the Book of Mankind. This is a metaphor that he used himself and which initially I didn't quite find all that inspiring, but actually eventually he developed it to such an extent that it came to be a real summary, as far as I'm concerned. His very way of summarizing his teachings, giving an outline of his teachings. So this is what I work on, really. The basis of the course, so-called course or seminar I give on Krishnamurti here in the Netherlands is based on this very idea, which I find now later in life very creative. Fundamentally, Krishnamurti takes a look at humanity, at each one of us, and how we embody a fundamental text, that each of us, consciousness itself, is the summation of the history of mankind. Each of us embodies it. And it is into the reading of that history that constitutes the ground of self-knowledge and transformation. And that book has a series of chapters. So I'm going to go through that a little bit. Most of this may not be all that new to you, but perhaps the very notion of an overall picture, that there is a structure, that there is an actual development and unfolding in Krishnamurti's teachings might be new. So I want just to share that with you in terms of, in case that is helpful in order to approach Krishnamurti overall and our lives, which is the really our subject of Krishnamurti's teachings. So I just read you one passage that he wrote and shared with all his schools. So that last time we met, that I joined you, we were talking about education. And I say that Krishnamurti's teachings are an education for mankind. And the schools are fundamentally the channeling of his teachings into a school setting. There's really no difference. It's all about self-knowledge. It's all about reading this book of humanity that we all embody. So I just read you that paragraph just to set the basis, the ground on which I'm proceeding. This is from the book, The Whole Movement of Life is Learning, which is basically the collection, putting together of the 2 volumes of his letters to the schools, plus some 16, 17 new letters that they had found that he had written actually before these ones that were included in the letters to the schools. So he says on letter 25, which was dated 1st of September 1979, he says at one point, to learn from books is important. But what is far more important is to learn from the book of the story of yourself. Because you are all mankind. To read that book is the art of learning. It is all there, the institutions, their pressures, the religious impositions and doctrines, their cruelty, their faiths. The social structure of all societies is the relationship between human beings with their greed, their ambitions, their violence, their pleasures, their anxieties. It is there if you know how to look. The book is not out there or hidden in yourself. It is all around you. You are part of that book. The book tells you the story of the human being, and it is to be read in your relationships, in your reactions, in your concepts and values. The book is the very center of your being. And the learning is to read that book with exquisite care. The book tells you the story of the past, how the past shapes your mind, your heart, and your senses. The past shapes the present, modifying itself according to the challenge of the moment. And in that endless movement of time, human beings are caught. This is the conditioning of man. This conditioning has been the endless burden of man, of you and your brother. I read it a bit dramatically because it is dramatic in the sense that it is the burden of you and your brother. My brother, who's my brother, we're all each other's brothers, is all our burden, the burden of everyone. And I also care for my brother. So if we care for one another, we have to see whether it's possible together to be free from this burden, because it is the source of conflict, violence, and sorrow in human existence. So that's a major responsibility that none of us can escape. But in that paragraph itself, if one really reads it carefully, one can see there are so many elements that is not so easy to unpack. Fortunately, Krishnamurti was a very good unpacker of his own teachings. So he later on made a much more detailed examination of that book and of the various chapters in it. In the second talk he gave in Sri Lanka in 1980, which is contained in this book, Magnitude of the Mind. If you look at that, it was published separately as the Book of Life, which is what I basically use as my reference for the outline of a study, proper study of Krishnamurti's teachings. So what are the chapters in this book? Krishnamurti was, I think, having a lot of fun when he gave that talk, because he himself was suddenly discovering that he could use the metaphor to summarize his own teachings. And I said, that was really fun. Krishnamurti didn't have much fun because he was always facing the tragedy of humanity, but occasionally he did. And he had really a profound sense of humor. I think truth is humorous because it shows the absurdity of what we do. And that's what we laugh about. Now, what are the chapters in this book? So he actually went and said, the first chapter says, the second chapter says, and I found that also very amusing. I could go along with him. And that's what I'm going to try to share. There are chapters in this book. So this book is nowhere to be found. It's not written, it's not published. Like he said, you cannot buy it in any bookstore, even if you buy a Krishnamurti book, because it is the book of mankind. It is what mankind has written and the script which mankind is following, and which mankind, you and me, me and my brother, have not so far been very good at reading. And that's why we are in the situation we're in. But it is that reading, he says, which is fundamental in order to bring about a different world, a different mind, a different heart, a different society. So I said, well, that interests me because I'm aware of all the difficulties there are and in which I am directly involved. I cannot separate myself from everything that's going on because I'm in that stream of consciousness. I'm in the stream of mankind. So please, sir, tell me how to read this book. So Krishnamurti kindly, compassionately says, all right, I'll show you. So what does he begin? He said, well, indeed, if you're going to read the book of mankind, the content, you first have to learn to read. If you don't know how to read, you cannot proceed. So he talks about 4 fundamental arts: the art of learning, the art of seeing, the art of listening, and the art of thinking together. That's an interesting one, since he seems to deny thinking all the way through. But yet he says, no, careful, we must be able to think together, which is what his dialogues also attempt to do, right? Can we think together? So to see, though, is fundamental, because a lot of what we do, the problems of mankind, if we examine them, have to do with perception. If we misperceive something, then what is the basis of our thinking? What is the basis of our action? So we're already trapped in a deception, in some kind of error. If we don't listen properly, the same is part of perception, same problem. So we have to comprehend, be able to grasp the facts. This was Krishnamurti's fundamental thing. Stay with the fact, see what is, because that is the only ground from which we can proceed with thinking, feeling, and action. Right? So that's fundamental. So learning is that quality of perception, is also grasping the meaning of what we see. Right? So we have a proper basis. And then when we think together, to think also on the basis of facts. Right? To think together is fundamentally the ground of, means communication. And he defined it very beautifully, right? But also in that definition, there is all the difficulties in the world, which is to see the same thing at the same time with the same intensity. So that is a tall order. Most of us are at some level or other, coming from a number of conclusions and beliefs and so on because of our cultural background. I come from the West, you are from India. All those are playing out there in the background. But if we are going to think together, we have to think past these divisions to the same common ground. And the common ground is what he's trying to describe. Krishnamurti didn't pause, didn't really pay much attention to all these so-called cultural differences, mentioned them occasionally. But being a Muslim or a Hindu or a Christian didn't make any difference in the end. It's only a difference that is borrowed. Deep down, we're all afraid. We're all seeking security. We're all selfish in one way or another, even though we say we aren't. So, all right, there is where he goes, to that same common ground of consciousness that is its structure. The common content of human consciousness is its structure, and that's what he's going into, and what we need to go into if we are to bring about, as we say, this transformation. So this was the first chapter in the book. Actually, it wasn't the first chapter. It was the introduction to the book, to learn the art of reading. Right? And this meant, he called it also the art of living, because that is central, is the basis. This is the first step, and for him, that was also the last. If we perceive rightly, if we can think together, see together, and think together, then we have the basis of proper cooperation, relationship, and harmony, right? I'm not even speaking about love, which would be actually the ground feeling of that, because there's no division among us. If we stay with the facts, what would be the division? It's only our takes on those facts that separate us, right? And our own personal interests, which separate us and distort those facts in order to satisfy our own desires. So we have to go beyond these factors. This is what he's appealing to. So we, in a way, the book cannot proceed unless we learn to read it. But we are going to proceed nonetheless because he described the content. So he says, what's the first chapter? He says the first chapter, mostly this is a pedagogical approach. You look outwardly to the world, to the human condition, how it manifests itself. So what the human condition manifests itself is as conflict. He sees disorder everywhere we go. Now that may sound too radical, but actually, if we pay attention, what's going on at home and abroad, in the street, in society, in politics, in the economic field, in everywhere, in the religious field even, is disorder. So we meet disorder the first thing in the morning. In the morning of our lives, when you wake up, you realize your father is angry and is abusive to your mother. And at school, they bully you. And the priest is telling you you are full of sin and you're going to hell, or whatever it is they're saying. And the politicians are quarreling endlessly with each other. The industrialists and the financiers are cheating all the way. Everybody's lying publicly. So there is disorder. There is not really a proper, integral, ethical concern that goes all the way through. Love is missing from this context. So he goes into that very clearly. He says, are we aware of that? And that intrinsically, each of us is responsible. That's the main point. Yeah, I say, oh, the politicians, oh, the bankers, oh, this, oh, that. No, it's in the stream. They are manifesting these tendencies which we have cultivated for X number of reasons or non-reasons down the ages. So to take that on board, that means that is me. I am disorder. I am responsible for this pervasive state of disorder. And this disorder in the outer domain has a number of reasons, number of causes. The primary manifestation is contradiction. You see, there you are. Are we in contradiction? Is society in contradiction with itself? Is the government, politically, you can see it, contradiction. Socially, contradiction. And we in ourselves are also in contradiction. We want to be good, but selfishness predominates. So we cheat and lie and are angry and all that kind of stuff. So contradiction is one of the broadest spectrums of disorder, almost like his heart. But socially, in the outward manifestation, which is what the first chapter we meet, we look outwardly for some reason until that outward becomes the mirror of what we are inwardly and draws us into consciousness. That outward disorder comes from a number of issues as well, from his perspective, from Koi's perspective, which is authority, tradition, and the overall and belief. So he questions three fundamental elements in what has come to be the structure of society. Tradition, what is handed over from the past. Authority, which is what enforces that tradition. And belief and knowledge, which are at the core content, what is transmitted from the past. He takes issue with those three core elements, which have become structurally fundamental in the ordering of society and becomes, in fact, a principle of education. In every society, these three principles are really what is being communicated and used to sustain society. Belief and knowledge, which is the core of tradition and maintained by authority. I thought that was interesting in my case because I was very aware of the destructive nature of this tradition. Authority itself denies love, denies intelligence, is imposition. It functions by fear and enforces conformity. That's the denial of intelligence, is the denial of sensitivity, is the denial of love, without which we cannot possibly bring about any kind of harmonious relationship at all. You are destroying the very ground on which order, creative order, can be brought about. So that's a total contradiction. The intent of tradition, the intent of religion, the intent of belief and knowledge and of authority is supposedly to bring across something good. But the means are the end. That's what Krishnamurti always said. And I think that's a great truth. The end is the means. If you use the wrong means, you get the wrong end. You cannot bring about goodness by means of fragmentation. Therefore, tradition, authority, belief, and knowledge in that sense, from imposition, are not the way of goodness. They deny freedom, they deny goodness. So look at that. He right away chops at the tree, has a go at the tree that structures our society, how we have brought it about together. We have not made a good world. We've gone about it the wrong way. Now, we're just talking about society, talking about the overall picture of the world. But the world is not out there only, but is me. The world is in relationship. This is a beautiful insight. I used to think, well, that's a bit too simplistic to say society is human relationship. And we are all in human relationship. We exist in relationship. Life is relationship. He kept going on at this. It sounds like a very simple statement to make, but actually the implications are vast. It is, everything is relationship. Nothing exists in isolation. That is a tremendous thing to say, because then I cannot conceive of myself strictly as a separate entity to begin with. If I really see that I am the world, and the world is me, the way he put it, what's the sense of separateness? What is it that will give me a sense of not being my brother, that brother that carries the same burden I do, like we mentioned from the quote? So that's a very extraordinary thing to say, and to really, how you say, assimilate, perceive for oneself, because that is one factor, fundamental factor of transformation. The world is divided, and that's because we think we're separate, because of our beliefs, because of our traditions, because of what our authorities tell us, and because of our self-interest, because we want to belong to one group or another. But that is not the answer to this question, because deep down there is no such separation. But that is in relationship every day. And what is my relationship, he asks? What is our relationship? Because if we really are related, then we don't have a problem, right? When there is love among cooperation and understanding, what's the problem, right? But people can also join together on the basis of an illusion, on the basis of tradition with which they identify, of a belief, of knowledge, of whatever power and whatever interest. Nationalism, for example, which has been one tremendous cause of war. We have not even grasped that much, that nationalism is a deadly device designed, brought about by any number of circumstances in history as a way for security and glory, right? This is still going on in Europe, where we're trying to do away with that, because Europe has been one of the great grounds of butchery in the history of mankind. Great science and great butchers. We cannot have that. Okay, so don't be a butcher, literally or metaphorically. Don't. Just say no to that. And the world is saying yes still, right? So we have the European Union, which was the most intelligent thing they could have done after the great disaster of the Second World War. See, they were getting better. Mankind was progressing in brutality. The technology was only helping to destroy better. So that is madness. That's a total contradiction. We're progressing in which direction? The K was always pointing that out, no? And we have to be very aware of it, because that's still going on. Mankind progresses technologically, and it remains the same old barbarian. That's a tremendous danger. And look what's happening. We have Brexit. The British never got it. They didn't see the point of peace, and the nationalism is a great danger to mankind. So they went back to parochial nationalism. Okay, we have to live with what is. So this is a major issue, and this is relationship. And the primary life, if life is relationship, and it is, then the quality of relationship is the quality of life. We don't seem to just that fact of how central relationship is, and how careful, how totally attentive we need to be in order for life to flourish. That's why relationship is also at the core of education, because it is the principle of order and harmonious coexistence. It's not even coexistence, there's no co, there's just it. If you know what I mean. See what I'm saying? This is therefore fundamental. But what is the ground of this relationship? He says, what's this relationship? So he finds another factor, which is divisive. This is where he goes always, right? You know that. The negative approach, to find that which denies relationship and freedom from that brings about the quality of relationship itself. It's not a formula. Okay, it has really no formulas. It is the denial of formula, the denial of pattern as a way to be. So we can't relate from pattern. We have to relate directly. And that's just the challenge, because we don't relate directly. We relate indirectly, mediated by all kinds of images. That's what he calls them. Images means everything, means concepts, ideas, beliefs, memories, and all the rest of it. So that's what he brings across. If you're relating through an image, then you're relating to the image. From that, you have an image of the other and you have an image of yourself. Those images relate. But it's that relationship between human beings, which is another very important aspect. Are we our own images? Or as human beings, there is something far deeper, wider to us. And that is what needs to relate. That is what can relate. So the question of relationship is actually a question of bypassing, if we can, through insight, of course, these images which are so predominant in ourselves and constitute the core of our psychology, the identity. That's where he goes next, because what he finds is that we not only are the whole of humanity in our, when he says that we are the whole of humanity, we are mankind. That's where we can relate at that level of universality. But that level of universality is in consciousness, is in experience to begin with. Everybody suffers, everybody seeks security, everybody is afraid, everybody is seeking pleasure, everybody is seeking power. The universal themes are there. I tended to think that Krishnamurti's teachings address the constants of human experience, the constants of human consciousness. These constants is what we must question, because that's there where the constant trouble arises from. So consciousness is the common ground of humanity. He comes to that point from looking at human experience, what we are all doing, and distilling the constants. He sees that consciousness is the same for everybody deep down, no matter what our tradition may have told us and how positive or negative that tradition may seem to be, is still the same. East, west, north, south. There's no east or west that way. There's no north or south. There's no man or woman. There is no white, black, pink, yellow, or blue, as he used to say. You call yourself white. He said once, I remember in one discussion at Brockwood, you may call yourself white, but actually, if you look, you're actually pink. You see, we misunderstand even our own colors, and we give it such importance. Suppose that all these suprematists were said, you know, you call yourself white, but you are pink. Pink supremacy. You think that would work? Anyway, you see the absurdity of what we do. So that's the question. Then he comes to consciousness. This is the ground. To see that consciousness is our common ground. That's extraordinary. We're in the stream of consciousness everywhere, all mankind. Maybe one level of knowledge or another level of knowledge, but still the same stream is running through. We can add knowledge and sophistication, and it's still the stream of consciousness with its constants remains. We just paint the house a different color and add adornments, but deep down the structure remains the same. And what he's saying is the revolution that he's calling for has to take place at the structural level, not at the level of the facade, which is what knowledge gives us. So there you are. And what is this consciousness? He says it's thought, is its content. That's another mysterious phrase. Consciousness is its content. Now, if you look at it just on the face of it, we would suggest that my content is different from yours because I have acquired all kinds of experiences from my childhood, and those are not the same as yours because I was born in that country, in that particular social milieu, with those particular people, good or bad, and so on. But again, the constants is what matters. I was afraid. You were too. I pursued pleasure or was taught to pursue it. So did you. And I was hurt by my environment. So were you. And I then tried to find security by pursuing knowledge or money or whatever it was. So did you. And the constants were there, east, west, north, south, independent of the so-called content that my culture gave me, because the content was already there, given by the stream of consciousness. I find that absolutely extraordinary. But then what do we build our lives on? On thinking, on the process of thought. Now, this is where Kay centers his study of mankind, his perception, deep perception of mankind, because he comes to the point of us understanding that thinking per se is not wholeness, is not the whole. And if we based our existence upon it, then we are again reducing the totality of our being to a fragment. And that fragment, therefore, must always be, if we take it to be the totality, we made another mistake. And we are again in contradiction with reality, because we cannot meet the whole of life. We cannot relate to life as a whole from that one fragment. This is a major, major thing. I'm not taking it as a conclusion. This is the important thing, not to take any of this as conclusions, because what Kay is appealing to all the time is, do you understand this as a fact? Do you have an insight into it versus having just an idea? So what we're going through now is just discussing or reflecting what he says. I'm not taking it for granted. This is a major, major and has deep implications if we say that thought per se is intrinsically limited, because it is the response of the past, and therefore it cannot meet the whole of life. We have thrown a tremendous spanner in the works of how human beings, how we have developed, and how our education, how our culture functions until now, because we're appealing to something else. Not to deny thought per se, but to see its own inherent limitation. That doesn't mean throwing, we have to be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? Because I used to argue with my friends, you say, oh, you're using a lot of thought. And what's the point of that, since thought doesn't help to bring about the truth? I said, well, my thought is limited, and therefore it will never get there. I said, yeah, my left foot is also very limited, but without it, I wouldn't get anywhere either. You understand? We have to be careful. We're not drawing absolute conclusions from anything unless we comprehend the true relation that has with what we're looking into. The limitation of thought is a fact. And yet thought is a very important instrument in communication and in understanding also. Because thought, to begin with, can become aware of what is contradictory. So that part of awareness of the disorder of mankind comes through the awareness of contradiction, which is what thought is very good at. So we have to use thought and then know when thought is not applicable. That's the art, to use everything we have and yet know what is its limitation, so we don't confuse ourselves in terms of what's the source of truth or perception and what's the source of psychological order. We have to go into that. Fundamentally, the disorder of thought doesn't seem to come just from itself, because thought has its own order. So thought per se is not the source of disorder, but there are misconceptions within it. One, thought is rooted in the biological conditioning of fear, of pleasure, of aggression, the whole developmental background, animal background of mankind. So there, we had to find another way to go beyond that limitation. Our instincts were part of intelligence, the animal intelligence of survival. But now they function blindly through thought, and that distorts thinking. So part of understanding is to comprehend the relationship between thought, pleasure, fear, and pain. He always begins there. I used to think, why does he go into consciousness via the emotional side? By looking at pleasure, fear, and pain. Well, because that's just the fact. That's how our consciousness is structured. Those are three of the fundamental principles of the animal intelligence, but which thought now is misusing by using memory to cultivate them. This is the fundamental ground of desire, which is the dominant factor of our psychological self-occupation. If there is an issue there, then we have a major problem, because we are busy with this movement of desire, which is based on this animal background of pleasure, fear, and pain, and is now fueled by memory, not by perception. We're trapped in the field of thought, in the field of memory, and that constitutes the fundamental search for fulfillment, for happiness, for self-worth in our lives. But he says, this is just memory. Where are you going? There's no real reality behind it. We're living in an illusion, therefore. Further illusory aspects that he sees, and this is a major one to examine, and perhaps the key, is the notion that there is, I am myself, a separate entity. The notion of the self, psychologically for K, arises out of the identification of thought with a number of contents, and then creates a kind of supra-entity called me or I, the ego, which is the one who thinks and the one who experiences. Instead of saying there is experience, and then there may be a processing by the mind of that experience, so it's a processor, it attributes an entity to that, and then it calls it me. This is a mysterious process. Why would thought identify with anything? Why is there this need to identify? Everything is happening. Do I identify with a sensation, with the sunlight? I don't. But yet I say, the light of India is very special. Or the light of California, or in Spain where I come from, my God, that light is just the best in the world. What is that about? It's just light. Why does it have to be my light and I identify with that? And then the culture, of course, all the kind of sophistication of differences that exist. Differences do exist, but why does one have to take that on board as being me? The me fragments again, because it takes part of reality as belonging to it and part as not belonging. So the vision again is a major issue that arises with the creation of a psychological self. And it's not only external, that's the thing, it's also internal, because it is a division in the qualities, the good and the bad, and therefore a split in consciousness itself. The psychologists call it the self and the disowned self, and they have built a whole structure on that, on what is around structure of repression and pursuit of that. So there is a major issue in identification as a key factor of fragmentation. Now, this is the very, very broad description of the phenomenal world that Krishnamurti is inquiring into. What he's aiming at is what? Is wholeness, is freedom, is a quality of integrity such that these divisive factors, if we were to perceive them and have an insight into them, would disappear, and we would create a completely different world, inwardly and outwardly. There's no separating those two. If there is no division inwardly, the chances are that I will relate in a wholesome manner. And that's what we have to look into, that inward wholeness. Is there such a thing? Which is also the outer wholeness of relationship. Inwardly wholeness means that the self is perceived for what it is a division in thinking, a separation that doesn't hold in actuality. There's no separation in identification. It means not identifying, therefore. It means perceiving the whole movement and not operating on the basis of memory in terms of our emotional world and our drives. But from perception. K brings it to perception. And of course, there is the rub in this thing, and the most difficult thing in this, therefore, that the key to this transformation lies in not separating ourselves from what we're looking at. That's a major thing, because the perceiver is already coming in with conclusions, with preconceived notions. We haven't looked at fear properly, anew, really experienced fear. What is it? Fear. What is loneliness? These are key aspects of this book of humanity, which are the writing on the wall, if you like. What is going to happen to us is written on this wall, and we're not able to read it because the reader is distorting what he reads. So this is the fundamental art, if it's possible at all, and that's a question for all of us, of course, to see whether we can read without a reader, observe without an observer, experience without an experiencer, that there's no separation. There is such a quality of oneness with what is, that no possible distortion arises. That's a tall order again. But without it, he suggested, there is no real art of living. This is the real art. If that is there, he suggested further, then we open up to a completely different field. We could call it the field of wholeness. I call it something, right? This is the field of fragmentation. This is the field of wholeness. There's a field of wholeness, which is operant, which is active, includes thought, includes perception, includes everything, but is now not functioning in contradiction and fragmentation. Right? You will use thought. Okay, use thought. But he used it, he said, in his right place. Well, all right, good for him. Maybe we're using it in the wrong place. Now, this was for him what he called meditation, from beginning to end. Meditation was at the core of what he was doing. I think that word has a lot of meaning in all kinds of cultures, particularly the Eastern world. Meditation has had a lot of meaning. And even though Kay had a problem with the word, because the word meditation means measure, and he denied measure, you see. So he said, okay, I mean something else. So he at the end was getting a bit fed up with always having to change the meaning in the dictionary to his own meaning. But it's all right. Meditation as this movement of non-separateness from what is, which is the ground of wholeness.
Voice is breaking.
Huh? Is it breaking?
We have problem with the audio.
Ah. Okay, you hear me now?
Sir, but with me there is no problem. I am able to hear him very
Okay.
clearly.
Okay. Okay, so I'll just finish, yes, because otherwise we won't have time for discussions. Which is, so this, I also cited this issue of meditation to bring it into this field of education. You see, at Brockwood, we had 10, 15 minutes in the morning to sit quietly. And apparently, when Krishnamurti first came up with the idea at the foundation of the school, he said, I want everybody to start the day with 30 minutes of silence. Now, the principal at the time, I have it from a good source, by the way, was Dorothy Simmons, of course, the first principal of Brockwood Park. And she objected to this because it sounded like a practice which Krishnamurti had always spoken against. And it sounded also like some kind of religious thing, a kind of sectarian practice. But Krishnamurti was insisting on the half hour, and Dorothy Simmons apparently saying, no, none. And so eventually they compromised on 15 minutes. So Brockwood Park's famous morning meeting, one of the most glorious things of the whole day at the school, because we were all together in silence, listening. Most beautiful thing to do. You see, just to feel that oneness, right? With others, with the world, with your senses, with your heart and your mind. To begin the day with that, not with the other machinations that are going on all the time, was the most beautiful thing. But even there, the 15 minutes was a compromise. Never could get half an hour to do the meeting. But this was the point. How do we live? Is our life a movement of wholeness? And is not wholeness based upon the quality of undivided perception and being? He says, in silence, we are together. In thought, we can also be together if there is perception of the fact together and with the same feeling, same intensity at the same time. But perception, silence, is the real ground, not the structure of consciousness. He used to say, you see, the ground of being is non-being. Our being is based upon this thought movement because it is something, but actually is no thing which underlies it. And he's saying, can we approach that ground, which is wholeness itself? So space, non-occupation, and silence as the ground of wholeness. And that as central to education. Brockwood Park's morning meeting as a way of living. Okay, I'm not going any further because otherwise we won't have time. Okay, so that's partly, just to conclude, Billy, that's what I'm exploring in this seminar. There's more to it. Krishnamurti then talks about death. I haven't talked about that. Or the sacred, the qualities of beauty, truth, and goodness as such that emerge out of this movement, right? So Krishnamurti's teachings is very complete that way, but he's just describing, and it's up to us to explore it. As in education is this, and he's helping us to educate ourselves in this whole field and see for ourselves whether this is at all possible. So the challenge is there for anyone to take up.
Thank you, Javier. I think you have covered the teachings completely, and I'm sure some of us would be able to read the Book of Life after listening to you. May I request Dr. Gajanan Rao to make some observations? Dr. Gajanan Rao. Sir, unmute yourself. Unmute yourself. Yeah.
Am I unmute?
Yes, yes, you are.
Yeah.
Javier is a unique name. I'm glad I'm seeing him. After 1993, if he remembers, we had him for our school inauguration, 1993, the Good Earth, in a township called Tamram. He had also come with Rajesh Dalal and Ahalyaji. Do you remember, sir?
I don't actually.
They're very shackly, a kind of with coconut leaves and all that, but a small building. So beautiful to have you there that day. And I still think it was something like a providence ordered. And you look not very much older, not old at all. This has to do with, I feel, each year passes by, you wonder why you're not feeling old. I feel the K puts that miracle into you. I'm 85. I don't feel it in a way, in the heart and mind. Maybe I'm bald. Fortunately, you haven't lost any hair. You're still black. Well, so nice to meet you. I was eager to attend this meeting, particularly because you were one of the three responsible for a school now on case lines, running beautifully on a 20-acre plot with 400 students and 45 teachers. I'm happy to be the chairman of that trust. Some of our other trustees of KFI are also in it as trustee board. And this question of relationship you took, I think is vital to case teaching. Really vital to case teaching. Where is relationship now? Anywhere. Between brother and sister, with wife and husband. My God, it's all bits. The whole world is thrown into bits. And I sometimes very sad when I listen to even great politicians, great men of other fields, even science. They don't bring Krishnamurti to mention as an example as to how relations should be really built among people. and be one body, as said, the famous word Krishnamurti often used. We can never be together. Never be together. That together was really the bottom of the whole. And then every you said, your consciousness and consciousness, the content is what you have given to it. When you think of all that, and of course it's not very easy to know, very easy to see that you are not different from the other, which he says that you are a world, seems to be a huge Mahavakya, big statement, and one doesn't understand it so easily. But then go a little deeply, sit down, and as he said, meditatively look at the sentence. You grab something of that sentence of you are the world and the world is you. When he was asked once, what is the essence of a teaching, sir? He said, I don't know, you must tell me. It was one of the discussions. A few minutes later, he suddenly remembered, he said, when you are, the other is not. The other is when you are not. That may be, and Prabhuji sort of really agreed, and I was not in the discussion, but I was watching it from around. That was a really awakening moment. And one more, one difficulty people all have, which I do have, when listening, when seeing, to be so intense that you're not separate from the object. There is a perceiver coming quickly there. And to be conscious that a perceiver sort of not so easy to me. But then it may be happening sometimes. I don't know. Something to listen to a friend, to somebody important, to look at a tree. The way he split the meaning between alone and loneliness is remarkable. You're alone, nobody around. You're nothing to relate to. That's not true. You have a tree to relate to. You have a Nirmal Akash, the huge sky to relate to, the stars to relate to. The next Shaivala brings you a cup of tea to relate to. So, relationship, as you said, I'm glad you brought this subject as the most vital of man's being. Relationship is most important for us to get on as a harmonious world, which we somehow forget to understand. I don't know why. And Krishnaji is not, fortunately or unfortunately, so popular to be with everybody in the world. But there is a language which you can use to explain. Even my driver, when he sits beside me, there are things I brought it to his notice. He said, yes, you're right, sir. So anybody can understand Krishnaji. It's not, but then of course, understanding, I mean, verbally at least, intellectually at least. But I have a feeling even intellectual understanding has some relevance, because what is stored into you after intellectual understanding may suddenly come up as something of a reality to you, and there you have learned more. So I am so glad I have the opportunity to see you. Thank you for being with us on the first day. It was glorious. You were so young. I met you later on, so the KFI must have forgotten me. I used to come those 2 years now and then. And later I became a trustee also. And I wish you are in India physically to be traveling. Thank you very much, sir. We have learned a lot from you. And I can understand you have been with it so much. It is very obvious. I'm happy to meet you, sir. And yes, let's have more questions.
Thank you, Dr. Rao. Thanks a lot, sir. Harshji, would you like to say something, sir?
Yes, I would. I would have a lot to say, particularly in talking with Javier. I don't know where to begin. First, let me say that I've had a long association with Javier, full disclosure. nearly 50 years now. I remember a young man who came to Brockwood. I was a teacher. I was one of his teachers, and we were all very interested in him because he came already to Brockwood with a very serious interest in the teachings, which he maintained throughout his time at Brockwood, and we have worked with each other, perhaps even thought together, discussed, had been in dialogues, and I think of all the changes that have taken place and the incidents in each other's lives. So we have a long history together, and it's interesting to see that he has continued his interest, and that he is sorry to speak like an old teacher, and that he is now helping others to explore Krishnamurti's teachings, what he has to say, because of course, as he says, it is actually of fundamental importance, particularly in today's world, which seems to be really going downhill in a way I would never have thought was possible. Take a look at America, what's happening there, how truth has completely been lost, and nobody can say what is real anymore. And so it's more and more important that we understand what he was talking about, what the self gets up to, and to read the book of life, as Javier is saying. So I would agree, I'm familiar with most of what he said, of course, that is, he has said very clearly and very well the essence of the teachings, the main points, and a good starting point for discussion, if we were having one. But I would like to add something, which is perhaps worth mentioning, which also Krishnamurti said. Because one of the things that he was very clear about was, don't take what I'm saying as gospel. Challenge it, see it for yourself. So when he talked today about the limitations of thought, I think all of us have a tendency to take on board what he says somewhat uncritically. But really he is saying to us, don't take it. See it for yourself. Push the limits. Try and find out what is the limit of thought. Don't accept anything that I have said, which is the same thing as saying, don't be a follower. Don't follow. You have to challenge everything within yourself and see for yourself. And one of the problems with that is that this requires intense application. Why should I delve into myself, into my life? What is it that is going to give me the motivation, the impetus, or whatever, to look so deeply? Because he's really asking us to look very deeply. Just to turn to the limitations of thought, I remember a discussion in Santvihar, which unfortunately was not recorded. It was a small group of people. And there was a Marxist kind of philosopher, politician, who was talking very much, arguing backwards and forwards with Krishnamurti, very much. Kind of a dialectic, which I'm sure Javier will understand. And so he said this very thing, but you're using thought to talk about this, about the limitation of thought. And Krishna, I'm pushing you to push thought to its limits, because until you've pushed thought to its limits, how do you know what the limitation of thought is? So that he was really not just telling us, not just reading the book of life, which he did. He always talked like that, like the whole of the self of consciousness was laid out in front of him. And he would pick up a chapter here or any aspect here, and he was immediately looking at it. It was not repeating something that he had said before or something that he remembered. He was reading the book of life. right in front as he was talking. And to accept what he has to say. At the same time, he's saying, don't follow. He would make please in the middle of his talk, says, please, sir, don't just sit there. Are you thinking about this as well? Are you thinking this for yourself? So this brings a really important question. One is, why should I believe this man? Why should I even make it in? Now, why should I be so interested in this book of life? What is it that it will do for me? People get into this. Really to challenge and question every single thing that he is saying. And the only way to do that is to set out to read the book of life for yourself. And that brings us to the second question, which I think Javier on, but probably needs a bit more saying. The question of observation. How do you observe? How do you even know that what you're seeing is true? And we are faced with this question in the large. You have Donald Trump in the US who is saying he won the election, and half of America believes him. I mean, how do you know what is true? How do you ever discover? And of course, I know what Krishnamurti would have to say about it, but rather than say it now, I would say that becomes an important thing to discover. We've talked about it before in this group. Choiceless awareness, intelligence in the way that Krishnamurti meant it, not in the normal everyday meaning of the word intelligence. How is that awakened? How is that? So, because without that, we can't even begin to read the book of life. So, to me, that's actually a primary thing that Krishnamurti was saying. I've said this before, even last week, that there is a subtle part of what he's saying. And the subtle part is not the content, what he's talking about, not about the limitations of belief or of tradition or of knowledge or anything like that, but the kind of mind that is necessary to be able to begin to make sense of the world, to begin to see what is happening with me. And this one has to do one being the middle of it, not that I'm suddenly become transformed person. But as he said, the first step is the last step. But the first step doesn't mean that you have achieved nirvana or something. It just means that you have at least to look. And that's what you're saying.
Thank you, Harji. Thanks a lot. Before we take up questions, may I request Professor Krishna if, sir, you have any observation to make? Professor Krishna.
No, I was practicing the art of listening and I want to stay with it. I've had many dialogues with Javier in Sanen and in Mexico and so on. It was a pleasure listening to him again, much more mature than what I knew him earlier, 20, 30 years ago. So very clearly put, excellent presentation. Yeah, no, I have no questions or comments to make.
Thank you, sir. Do we have questions?
May I request Professor Krishna to announce his lecture next week on mystery of consciousness? Mystery of Consciousness next week by Professor Krishna. That is what I have to announce only.
Okay, okay, we'll do that. I think there is a question coming from Mr. Trinesh. Would you like to say, sir, Mr. Trinesh? Sushilji, please unmute him.
Yeah, thank you. Are you able to hear? Hello?
We are able to hear. Please go on.
Thank you, thank you. My question is regarding the relationship. When we talk about relationship, we normally think that, I am related to my parents, I am related to friends, family members, I am related to my teacher. There is a reason behind that, which are all related to our traditional thinking. But if someone is not familiar to us, like someone staying at some corner of the world, we don't say that we are related to him. It looks like the traditional meaning is taking some reason to say that I am related to someone. But you, in order to feel that I am the world, so I must understand that I am somewhere related to the whole world, the whole mankind. So what is this, from this angle, what is the meaning of being related to someone or something? Thank you.
Yeah, well, in English, though, our families, or the people who are in the same family, are called relatives.
Right.
So those are the people we're supposedly related to, right? Our relatives. And I always found that a bit ironic. I like words, and the word relative, of course, suggests other things. There's nothing absolute about it. It's all relative. We're all related, and we are related in an immediate way, supposedly, physically, emotionally, with those immediately around us. So that's why we are related to these people and not to those people, right? My family, I'm related to them, but I'm not, these are not my relations. They are the others, right? But that's a narrowing of the field. We are related. Look at it, what comes to us, even when we are within this family, the whole world comes to us via our education, via information, and via the stream of thought. Kate said something very beautiful once, saying, as long as you think, you are not alone. Because you are in the stream of humanity. To think is to be mankind. You may think a particular thing, and that particular thing may separate you or confine you to another set, a group, like the followers of Trump. They think that, and they belong to that group, and they separate themselves from others, and therefore they're not related to the others. But the actual thinking is more primary, and therefore they are related to everybody else, no matter what they do. To come to that point of relationship, of intrinsic connection, relationship means, so to perceive the fundamental connection is really what is at stake, right? If we can see that, then we're related to the whole. And then there is an issue of relationship even beyond thought. In the silence that we mentioned before, that takes me out of my family, takes me out of myself. See, the self is his own confinement. And even within the field of consciousness is its own confinement, no matter how universal it may be. There's another field even deeper than that, which implies a much deeper sense of relationship when the self is not. There are depths to the meaning of relationship, therefore. That's what I think you were pointing to, right? We have to begin from where we are, and we sense relationship is here and there in this most immediate way with these particular people in this particular context. But that particular context contains the universal seeds of all relationships in all contexts. And that's what we need to get to if we are to really be together. Somebody pointed that word as being fundamental. Together in this other dimension. There are dimensions, and we are together in the deeper dimension with the whole world and beyond. Does that go somewhere near to pointing away to?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
Question from Dinesh ji and Rangabharti. So Dinesh ji, you first.
I want to ask a question. Why do we make issue of this authority, nationalism, tradition, images, etc.? This is also a fact of life. Similarly, conflict, anger is also a fact of life. So can the mind, why mind is going into exclusion, either this or that? Can the mind be not remain still sensitive and fresh, innocent, despite of all these facts of all the disorder what you talk?
What do you think?
I think there is a possibility. If one understands the whole structure, then he can go, he can transcend it, and what you said, the silent mind. Still, there is a possibility that despite of all this fact, one can remain in that. Why should we go in for exclusions?
I missed the last thing. Why would we go into what?
Exclusion. Why does the mind think either or this? Either I am there or other is there. Why?
Are you pointing to the fact that the primary thing is to stay with the facts and to understand those facts? Yes. You see, when we were not, I wasn't particularly trying to create a dualistic way of thinking, but rather to say, if we look into these issues, then we see that they are counterproductive. If we, you mentioned tradition, belief, and authority. Now, I mentioned those three because they are very, very much ingrained in our social structures and the way all of us have been brought up. Pretty much, I would dare to say. And therefore, to even at that level, which is external, social, structural, to see that we are approaching the question of human wholeness, the flowering of goodness, in the wrong way. That's not dualistic. It's a question of understanding whether that really contributes to goodness or it does not. And if it does not, if it's in contradiction, if it undermines its own purpose, that's the fundamental meaning of contradiction. You aim at something, but the means denies the end. So that's a very, one intrinsic, very fundamental aspect of human intelligence, to perceive whether the end and the means really go together. And we're saying these means do not lead to that end. That's not dualistic. It's not an opposition to anything. It's just, is there a proper understanding of these movements and that they are in contradiction with their own intent? Therefore, they're meaningless at that level, whatever other meaning they may have, like knowledge being transmitted down, right? Or administrative authority in a school, or what? Yeah. So you see what I'm saying? It's a question of inquiry, and I think you're pointing that out. It's not in opposition or be against something or react against something, but it's what we have experienced also, how it has come to us, how it has molded us, how it has distorted our being. We have to, this is what our primary concern is, I think. And therefore we see that these are factors that have distorted our psyche, our hearts, have undermined our integrity as human beings, tradition, authority, belief.
Okay, thank you.
Rang Bharti, Rang Bharti,
Yes.
Rang Bharti.
Yes, thanks sir for the talk. Like, hope my voice is clear. First, I would like to, before this talk, I would like to thank you for the article that you wrote in Friedrich Grohe's newsletter regarding translation and interpretation. I found it very insightful, and I shared it with many of my friends. So that's the first thing that I wanted to say. And I really enjoyed your talk. It was, although I expected more from it, in that sense, like you couldn't cover many stuff, but it was funny and insightful. So thanks for that. But my curiosity is that in the introduction that someone had written about you before the Zoom meet to share it, they had said you had started a course for Krishnamurti. I was just curious about that. I mean, what do you mean by that? Does Krishnamurti really need a course? Everything is out there in the open. And even to, I think another guy, Ruben Feldman Gonzalez Krishnamurti had said when he asked him like how to go about, should I read the whole thing? And he was making a joke, you don't get down at some station when you go from one place to another. And he was saying, asking him to read it from the back, meaning from the 80s to the 30s. So when everything is, especially these days, when everything is available on the internet, the videos, the books, everything is there. What is there to take a course?
Yes, that's a good question. Yeah, you see the word course already throws one off, right?
Yeah.
Right, because it implies there's a body of knowledge that is going to be imparted by someone to someone. So Krishnamurti wasn't operating in that way to begin with. He was saying, here is something that, a field that we're looking into together. But that's how I take it, you see. Is there a point? See, the point of the course, so-called course, see, I have a problem with the word also when I say it already, because it sounds like I'm going to be the authority who's going to communicate what someone else said in an intelligent manner, right? Well, I try to do that, certainly, but I'm no authority, right? Because what we're looking at is whether we can together perceive what we are about. And that's this map that Krishnamurti paints. Is that helpful? Is that mirror helpful in our own seeing? It's very different. And is there not a necessity for that? Is there not an urgency, in fact, in the world as a whole, to be able to hold up a mirror to our own nature and together, out of a profound feeling of concern for what we have become as human beings, what we make of our lives, of the world, and of other people's lives, isn't that our primary responsibility? And therefore, we come together and look into this as deeply as possible. That's the only thing I'm trying to do, to say, here is one of the, as far as I'm concerned, one of the deepest, the most insightful descriptions of what it means to be human. And as we are concerned with our humanity and our wholeness, is it not therefore important that we look into it without authority, without dogmatism, without conclusion, but together, out of our mutual concern? That's the only thing the course is intended to do. And the course, please put lots of quotes around it in that regard, right? In that, it's not.
I don't know, but I mean, it's already out there in the open. Like, because I'm just curious, because are you trying to like get into some university or something? Because Ruben Feldman Gonzalez tried to do that. He even had some name for that, Holo. I don't remember it, something like that. So is it like for some academic approval to somehow sneak in their university and put Krishnamurti there? Is it because of that?
No. That's not my intent. So,
okay.
That's not my intent.
Okay.
It's only that a group of people come together and look at what Krishnamurti has said. It's in a concentrated way, if you like, you see. For example, the structure that I have developed is 14 meetings in which he goes through Krishnamurti's biography and then goes through these things that I've just described in much more detail. But of course, giving space, the thing is not to just take Krishnamurti's words and then answer a question in an exam. What did Krishnamurti say about freedom? All right. But Krishnamurti he wasn't concerned with that, right? He was concerned with what he said was a good aid to us discovering our freedom. Right? For us, it's quite different to talk about freedom and being free. So no, look, I also don't, by the way, I don't have a problem with Krishnamurti being taught in university if it's done in this way. University is a very beautiful word in itself. It's misused again. It means universality. And to me, there's nothing more universal than Krishnamurti's teachings. They belong in university, but not in an academic way. See, this is a very subtle problem that you are bringing forward. How do we proceed further with the teachings, right? What is an appropriate way to bring the teachings across and engage with them together? Right?
I guess I think I understand that when you mean by course, it's like you're having your dialogue. Like it's probably something more elaborate than that. That you're calling it as course. Like that's what I could understand from this.
I'm just calling
Sir,
it.
may I request Ashish to Ashish wanted to ask a question. Ashish wanted to ask a question and has been recommended by a would-be speaker. So please, Ashish, ask your question.
Let's take the last question now. Ashish, please go ahead.
Yes, sir. My question is to speaker. Sir, am I audible?
Yes.
Yes, you are.
Yes, you are.
Sir, that I am bound to see whether the world of external or internal with my background, my identification, and now as Krishnamurti is also the part of my known. So I am bound to see everything with all these baggages, and I am already seeing with interference of my known. What are the key of seeing everything neutrally? Is there anything? Sir, actually English is not my first language, so my question is clear to you. That
Speaker has got a second English. His main language is Spanish.
Well, we do have English in common, which is a good thing. In spite of
as a second language.
One good thing, you know.
Sir, actually, my question.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry. Actually, I am the identification, the preconceived notion, my background, the known from the Krishnamurti is also an interference now. Whether it is possible to see anything neutrally with all these interferences, sir, I want the point from you, please.
I have the very same question you have. I am very much in the same boat. But to me, the first thing in this is to actually see how the known is.
Your voice is breaking.
But the first thing is to see the known is in operation. This is what we don't see. The very known blinds us to its own operation. We lack self-awareness in terms of, we say that the known is operating, but we don't see it in operation. So the key is to see whether the known is in operation or not. The known disguises itself as perception of what is, whereas it's just a projection from what was. We miss this perception. We miss the perception, the deception that we carry out on ourselves by taking projections as facts. You understand what I'm saying? So this is, to me, that's the key, to really see how the known is operating and therefore creating a distortion in perception. If I see that, then the known is instantly removed. And therefore I'm in the neutral state that you talk about. in which I'm not projecting. Our problem is projection from the past, from the image. But we have to see the image. And the image generally disguises itself as perception. This is the problem. To be quicker than the image, to really perceive the image as operating. If we don't see that, we won't get to the neutral point. So the attention has to be given to the movement of perception itself and where that is coming from. If it's actually directly in contact with things, or is a projection of knowledge, memory. So to pay attention to the movement of thought is the key to that neutrality, because that will determine whether it's applicable or not applicable. And generally, in fact, knowledge is not applicable in the first instant of perception, and perception is faster than knowledge, as a matter of fact. But we miss it somehow. We miss that speed. It's a question of speed. Interesting. See, the perception, when you look at a tree, the first is the sensation, but thought comes in very quickly and kind of brushes aside that total novelty that actually the sensation was bringing through. The past comes like a countercurrent to absorb it into itself. If we perceive that countercurrent, and that is distorting and preventing, in fact, the emergence of the new that is always there, in fact, then we can begin to take that begins to not just slow down, but it begins to disappear because it's irrelevant to the perception of the new. It may be relevant to the communication, but it's irrelevant to the perception.
Can we slow this down a bit, Javier?
Oh, okay, go ahead.
Yeah. I'm somewhat aware of the movement of thought and how thought is affecting. Otherwise, this gentleman, that's what he's saying. He's saying that he can see the thought coming in. He can see his past. Even Krishnamurti has become kind of a thought process that is interfering. So I am somewhat aware, or one is somewhat aware of the movement of this. So at this point, where you can see the distortion taking place, that this is getting in the way, that not that it's getting in the way, that is also happening, that it is, you're looking at things, but maybe even looking at thought. But what Krishnamurti has said about thought, even today, is also coming in. And that's clearly memory, not what is happening just now. It's clearly a memory. That is, and so it's, in that sense, it's not that immediate. So can we stay at that point where you're listening?
May I interrupt you, sir? Mr. Dubey has been not able to unmute himself. Please. Then he is not remaining on. Please do something. He is not going to speak. Now you can go on, sir. Tankha, sir, you can go on.
Well, I think sort of lost the moment, but I'm pointing to the, see if we can, even as we begin to observe the movement of thought to some extent, and we can see how things are arising in us, which are not what is immediately in front of us. Let's say we are talking about relationship, and in a relationship, as it's actually occurring, right now, there is a relationship between us over here. In this, things are coming, but are being said, we are listening to each other, but also things are arising from what we have heard in the past, what we have felt, questions we've had. That whole process is taking place. So I think the gentleman was saying when we see that things are coming in.
Mr. Toke, Dubey sir is not able to unmute himself. I am repeatedly saying it. He is not able to unmute himself. Something is wrong.
I have unmuted myself. I have
सर उनको कोर्स बना दिया है जैन साहब.
Okay.
Here.
Since we don't have any questions now, should we close? Yeah, Mr. Verma had the last question. Please unmute yourself. Unmute yourself.
One assurance from speaker. If he calls himself related, he has to visit now and then here. And last question.
Yes, Mr. Verma, please go ahead. Verma sahab, please go ahead.
Question. He's thinking something.
Sorry,
unmute yourself, Verma ji.
Yes, sir.
Verma ji, unmute. Yes, you can go ahead now.
I'm audible, sir?
Yes.
Yeah, very well audible.
We know that we all are conditioned and associated orders and disorder. My question will little hypothetical. How an perfectly orderly person will view this present day world? How he will view it? Perfectly orderly, and please consider observer is the observed also, because the person who is able to see has something inside him also. So how a perfectly, whether we call these people and their observations as observations of perfectly orderly people? That is my question. How?
Well, I think you're describing the teachings. I think the answer is Krishnamurti's teachings. The world today, as seen by one who's not in confusion, is what the teachings describe. You see. So, but I think coming home a little bit, it's up to us to see that the world is in disorder. If we see that and that conditioning is behind the disorder, then it's up to us. It's our responsibility. The chap who had the insight already did his job. Thank goodness. And he reflected that very clearly. Thank goodness too. But now it's up to us to see whether we can embody that goodness by perceiving the causes of disorder and seeing that it is us and being free from those causes. We have to do the work ourselves. This was the problem Krishnamurti always had, wasn't it? He wanted to make humanity absolutely and unconditionally free, but he knew he couldn't, because it's each of us that has to do the job, and we have to do it together, because at the end of the day, there's not you or me. That's also the beauty of it. Huh? So if we perceive, you and I, something true, then we're already there. We have to keep going. I'm not giving up. That's why that's what keeps me young.
Sir, fix 7th February for the speaker. 7th February for the speaker if he agrees to it.
Javier,
so that other questions will be answered.
What?
So the other question can be answered.
There are no questions.
Please ask the speaker if he is free on 7th February.
Javier, there is a request. There is a request if you are available on 7th of February.
Or 14th February, 7 or 14th, either or.
7th or 14th February to talk to this group.
It should be possible. Just let me know
okay.
what date you.
I'll send you a formal letter to that effect. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think we have come to the end of our session, and I want to thank Javier once again for he was very kind to accept our invitation and talk to this group. Thank you so much. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very
Thank you,
much.
Javier.
For every
See you.
Bye.
Thank you.
my request.
Bye bye.
Thank you, Dubey sir.